The room smelled like cheap coffee and old carpet. I sat at a long table in a government building in Edmonton, across from my husband of 19 years, and I watched him smile at his lawyer like they had already won. His name was Daniel, and that morning he was very, very confident. I remember thinking how strange it was. The way he leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the side, like he was at a hockey game and not a mediation hearing that was going to determine the next 30 years of my life. He hadn't looked at me once since I walked in. Not once. And I think that said everything. The mediator, a quiet woman named Ms. Okafor, shuffled her papers and asked us both to please keep the tone civil. Daniel's lawyer cleared his throat. He was a tall man, expensive suit, the kind of confident that comes from billing $400 an hour. He said something about assets and contribution and earning capacity. He used a lot of words that sounded important, then Daniel said it. He didn't shout. He said it the way you say something you've believed for a long time, the way you say something you think is simply a fact. She was never really working, he said. Not in any way that counts, she was a volunteer. She handed out pamphlets and answered phones. Let's be honest about what that was. His lawyer nodded. Ms. Okafor made a note. I looked down at my hands and I thought, let him keep talking, I need to go back. Because none of this makes sense unless you understand where I started. And what I chose to do with 19 years of my life while Daniel was building what he kept calling our future. I grew up in a small town outside of Red Deer, Alberta. My mother worked at a grain elevator. My father drove long-haul trucks and was home maybe 120 days a year if we were lucky. We weren't poor exactly, but we weren't comfortable either. I learned early that the only things that were really yours were the things you worked for yourself. I was 22 when I joined the Canadian Red Cross. It started because my neighbor's daughter was born premature, and I drove her to appointments every Tuesday for 8 months because her mother didn't have a car. One of the nurses at the Foothills Hospital told me I had a natural way with people in crisis. She said I should think about disaster relief work. I thought she was being polite, but I went to the information session anyway. That was 1991, and what followed was not a hobby. I trained for 2 years before I was deployed anywhere. The Red Cross doesn't send people out because they're enthusiastic. They send people out because they know exactly what they're doing. I completed emergency shelter coordination training in Ottawa. I did first aid and mental health first aid long before that was a common term. I studied mass casualty response protocols. I learned how to set up a reception center for 300 displaced people with nothing but 2 folding tables and a radio. My first deployment was the 1993 flooding in southern Manitoba. I was 24 years old, standing in a gymnasium in Morris with 200 people who had watched their homes fill with water overnight. A grandmother named Mrs. Penner sat on a cot in the corner and couldn't stop shaking, not from cold, from shock. I sat with her for 4 hours. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just stayed. I came home and I cried in the parking lot of the Edmonton airport for 20 minutes. Then I went back to work. Over the next 12 years, before I met Daniel, and then alongside our marriage, I was deployed to the Manitoba floods again in 1997. I coordinated emergency lodging for over 400 families displaced by the Red River. I worked the ice storm response in eastern Ontario in 1998, where I supervised a team of 18 volunteers across 3 reception centers. I was in British Columbia during the wildfires of 2003, managing family reunification for people who had been evacuated so fast they didn't know where their own parents were. I rose through the organization. Not because I sought titles, because when something had to be done, I figured out how to do it. By 2001, I was a regional emergency services coordinator for Alberta and the Northwest Territories. I managed a volunteer base of over 200 people. I developed intake protocols that the national office eventually adapted for use across the country. I was asked to present at a national emergency preparedness conference in Winnipeg. I was 32 years old, and I stood at a podium and spoke to 200 emergency management professionals about best practices in mass displacement response. I have a certificate of recognition from the Government of Alberta. I have a letter of commendation from the Canadian Red Cross National Office signed by the President. I have photographs from a dozen deployments, in rain gear, in borrowed rubber boots, in gymnasium after gymnasium and community center after community center across this country. And Daniel called it handing out pamphlets and answering phones. We met in 2004 at a fundraising dinner. He was an engineer with an oil company. He wore a good suit and he said all the right things. He told me that what I did was remarkable. He said it over dinner, and again when he drove me home, and again in the first years of our marriage. I believed him. I think about that now. How much I believed him. We got married in 2006. His work was demanding. He was moving up, promotions coming fast, the oil patch was booming, and there was money everywhere if you were positioned right. I scaled back my Red Cross commitments to support his schedule. When he was transferred to Calgary in 2009, I reorganized my volunteer role to be more regionally flexible. When his mother was sick in 2011, I took on her care coordination for 4 months while still managing my Red Cross responsibilities, and never once asked him to adjust his work schedule. We talked about children. It didn't happen. That's its own story and not one I'll tell here. But I will say that grief is a thing that either brings two people together or quietly, slowly shows you who they really are. Daniel started calling my work your little projects around 2013. I noticed. I told myself I was being sensitive. In 2015, I was deployed to Fort McMurray in preparation for wildfire response planning. The big fire was coming and those of us in emergency services could feel it. I was gone for 11 days coordinating pre-positioning of supplies and communication infrastructure. Daniel didn't ask about the work when I came home. He asked if I'd remembered to pay the TELUS bill before I left. I had. Of course I had. The Fort McMurray fire came in 2016. 88,000 people displaced in less than 48 hours. It was the largest evacuation in Alberta's history. I worked 20-hour days for 3 weeks. I cried twice. Once in a parking lot in Lac La Biche, and once in a bathroom at the Northlands Evacuation Center in Edmonton, when a man came in looking for his elderly mother, and I had to tell him she was already registered and safe. He sat down on the floor and wept, and I stood there and held his hand and I thought, this is the work, this is what it's for. I came home 17 pounds lighter and Daniel said I looked tired. He meant it as an observation. That was the worst part, there was no malice in it. I had just become part of the background of his life. I started to understand something that I didn't want to understand. The separation came in the spring of 2023. He didn't want a divorce. Not at first. He wanted things to go back to the way they had been, which I slowly understood meant me being convenient and undemanding while he advanced his career. When I told him I wanted to separate, he looked at me like I had said something confusing. "You don't have income," he said. That was his first sentence. Not why. Not can we talk about this. Just, you don't have income. He was right that I hadn't drawn a salary from the Red Cross. Most of my work over the years had been in a volunteer leadership capacity, which is common and well understood in the nonprofit sector. But I had also spent 3 years earlier in my career as a paid coordinator, and more importantly, I had spent 19 years managing our household, his career transitions, his family obligations, and my own substantial community contributions in a way that had materially supported his ability to earn. His lawyer didn't see it that way. In the months that followed, his position became very clear. He wanted the equity in the house. We had a home in West Edmonton, bought in 2008, worth considerably more now. He believed I had no standing to claim significant spousal support, because, as he put it, I had chosen not to pursue a career. He said this in front of his lawyer. He said it in front of my lawyer. He said it in emails. I printed the emails. I printed a lot of things. My lawyer, a woman named Andrea, who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, told me to gather everything. Anything that documented what I had actually done. Certificates, commendations, photographs, correspondence, news coverage. She told me to think of myself as building a file. I had been building that file for 30 years. I just hadn't known that's what it was. The mediation session was in February. The one where Daniel sat back in his chair like he had already won. I had a folder in front of me. It wasn't thick. I had selected carefully. When Daniel's lawyer finished talking, finished describing me as a woman who had made a lifestyle choice to avoid the workforce, Andrea asked if she could share some context. Ms. Okafor nodded. Andrea slid a single document across the table. It was a 2-page summary, not something I'd made up. A 2-page briefing note from the Alberta Emergency Management Agency, dated 2016, referencing my team's coordination role in the Fort McMurray evacuation response. My name was in it 3 times. In one paragraph, I was described as having provided critical coordination infrastructure during the most complex domestic displacement event in Alberta's recorded history. Daniel's lawyer picked it up. He read it. He put it down. He picked it up again. Daniel leaned over to read it from his side, and I watched his expression do something I hadn't seen it do in years. It went uncertain, just for a moment. But I saw it. Andrea then placed, one by one, 5 more documents on the table. The letter of commendation from the Red Cross National Office. The certificate of recognition from the provincial government. A newspaper article from the Edmonton Journal in 2016 with a photograph of me in a site command tent outside Fort McMurray, being quoted about family reunification logistics. A formal reference letter from the National Director of Emergency Services, and a printout of the National Intake Protocol that I had developed in 2009, still in active use, with my name in the acknowledgements. Nobody spoke for a moment. Daniel's lawyer set the documents down. He looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at the newspaper photograph, the one of me in rain gear, standing at a whiteboard, covered in zone maps and registration numbers, with the kind of expression on my face that comes from not having slept properly in 4 days and not having time to think about it. Your client described this woman as someone who handed out pamphlets, Andrea said. Her voice was very even. I'd like that characterization to be part of the formal record. Daniel's lawyer cleared his throat. He asked Ms. Okafor if they could take a short break. She said yes. Daniel stood up, and he didn't look at me. He walked to the corner of the room, and his lawyer followed him, and they spoke very quietly for several minutes. I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. My hands were steady. Andrea leaned over and touched my arm very briefly. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I want to tell you something about those documents, about what it felt like to have them sitting there on that table. For a long time, years, honestly, I had let Daniel's framing become something I half believed myself. Not the pamphlets and phones version exactly, but something adjacent to it. A quieter version. The sense that what I had done wasn't real work in the way his work was real work, that it didn't count in the way that a salary counts, that the value of it was sentimental rather than substantial. I think a lot of women know what I mean. I think a lot of people who have built their lives around care and service and community know exactly what I mean. There's a particular kind of erosion that happens when someone you love consistently treats your contributions as lesser. It doesn't happen in one conversation. It's not one comment. It's 1,000 small moments where what you do is described as nice, or sweet, or a good hobby, until you start to hear it in your own head. I'm not saying Daniel was a villain. I'm saying he was a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that work that doesn't generate a T4 isn't real. And I had spent too many years not pushing back on that. The documents didn't just help my case. They reminded me of who I had been the whole time. The settlement came 3 months later. I'm not going to share the specific numbers. That's between me, Andrea, and the Canada Revenue Agency, honestly. What I will say is that the court recognized the full scope of what I had contributed to our marriage, including the non-financial contributions, which under the Family Law Act in Alberta are absolutely legitimate grounds for support and property division. We sold the house. I received a fair share. I'm living now in a rented condo near the river valley in Edmonton. I have a small balcony and a very opinionated cat named Peanut, who came from the SPCA and behaves like she owns the property. Every morning I make coffee and look at the trees. I went back to volunteer with the Red Cross last fall. Part-time right now. There's a new coordinator in the Northern Alberta team who reminds me a little of myself at 26, competent and serious and not yet sure that she belongs in the room. I try to tell her when I can that she does as. A friend of mine asked me recently if I regretted not fighting harder, earlier. Not pushing back on Daniel's framing when it first started. Not defending myself more loudly when he dismissed what I did. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I don't regret the work. Not a single deployment. Not a single night in a gymnasium or a reception tent or a makeshift family reunification station in a high school parking lot. I don't regret any of it. What I understand now is that I never needed Daniel to recognize it. The recognition was always there, in the documents, in the work, in the people who had been helped. It existed completely independently of whether he acknowledged it. The most painful thing wasn't that he didn't know what I had done. It was that I had spent years caring whether he did. At the end of that February mediation session, when we were all gathering our things to leave, Daniel finally looked at me directly for the first time all morning. He didn't say anything. I don't know what I expected. An apology, maybe, or at least an acknowledgement. Something. But he just looked at me. And then he looked away. I thought about Mrs. Penner sitting on that cot in the gymnasium in Morris, 30 years ago. shaking and not saying anything, because sometimes there's nothing to say. And I thought about what it means to stay anyway. To keep showing up. To do the work even when no one is counting. I picked up my folder. I said goodbye to Ms. Okafor. I walked out into the February cold with Andrea, and the air smelled like snow and exhaust and something clean underneath it all. And I thought, I know who I am. I knew it the whole time. I just forgot for a little while to act like it.